Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we are going to take a look at the upcoming solar eclipse in the sign of Sagittarius. Before I dive in, I wanted to remind all of you guys that I'm in the home stretch of my fundraising for my YouTube channel in 2021. There's about 20 days left or so in my fundraiser. We just crossed the 600 backer threshold. Thank you, everybody, for pitching in so far. I really appreciate it. With about 3 weeks left to go to break last year's record, we still need to get 89 more backers. So we're closing in on that. Remember that when you can find the Kickstarter link in the comments section of this video or in the description. You click on it, you go to the Kickstarter page, and you'll find that there are a number of different rewards that I offer, reward readings, exclusive lectures that I'm not posting anywhere else, as well as half off to all of my online training programs in 2021. My Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic course, it starts in June and November next year. You can start with either cohort, and then there's my horary class and my advanced class, my year 2 program. So check those out. I'd love to see some of you in class. It's a great time to save on those programs and help support my work in 2021. For all of you guys who like or subscribe or share my work, if you get something good out of it, I really appreciate your support and hope that I can make another really good year of content for all of you. So thanks. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in. There's a bunch of things to cover here with this eclipse. So I'm breaking this up into 2 parts. Today, we're going to focus on what it means that this particular eclipse is happening in Jupiter's sign, while Jupiter is just about to change signs. During the actual lunation cycle of the eclipse, this new moon that's starting, within that new moon cycle, Jupiter will change signs. The host of the eclipse is changing. So that's very important. The other thing is this is a south node eclipse. A solar eclipse on the south node means something very specific compared to, say, a north node eclipse. So what's the difference, and how might you notice this in your own life or in general? I'm gonna give you some examples of people who are also born with the sun and the south node in a conjunction, just to give you a sense of what kind of maybe broader life karma is associated with sun and the south node. It's also, there's a couple of other things that are happening in close proximity to this eclipse that are a part of it. It's not a normal eclipse. It's a very powerful one because of what's surrounding it. And that's a big part of how you study and unpack an eclipse. And then on Monday, I will take a look at the eclipse through all of the houses and give everybody a chance to, plug the meaning into your own birth chart. For starters, let's go ahead and pull up the real-time clock, and I'll just give you guys a look at the specifics here. So this eclipse, get it up on the screen. Let's plug in the outer planets as well. So this eclipse is coming to you courtesy of Jupiter. It's a solar eclipse happening in Sagittarius, which is Jupiter's sign. Now, you can see that eclipse right here. It's got Mercury coming in as well, pretty close. So Mercury is a pretty beat up Mercury at the moment, with being combust, being in its detriment, being crossing over the south node of the moon. Mercurial things should pick up in the next couple of weeks once Mercury gets that separation from the sun and gets into Capricorn. So that's something that an underlying theme that also is influencing this eclipse, which I'll talk about later. The other thing that's happening is Jupiter is getting ready to change signs in the lunation cycle ahead. That means that the host of the eclipse, Jupiter, in its fall in Capricorn, signals perhaps a certain amount of difficulties, followed very closely by a change in status for Jupiter. Jupiter picks up dignity, and so a dramatic turn probably that will be a part of this. And thankfully, it looks like a turn that could be from bad to better, from difficult to at least neutral, or kind of what I want to say is what starts off looking like it could be very problematic may take a turn for the better. And that's also what we're pointing to, is also the fact that this solar eclipse is happening right before the Great Conjunction. So the host is not only going to change signs, pick up dignity, but it's also going to conjoin with Saturn in Aquarius, its home sign, and signifies the beginning of a new era in our lives. So this is not, like, again, you can see this is not just your normal eclipse. What else is happening right after the eclipse within the lunar cycle ahead? Mars is going to square Pluto. Very dynamic transformation. So you're seeing evidence of dynamic changes all across the board. You have Jupiter changing signs, picking up dignity, conjoining with Saturn, creating the Great Conjunction in Aquarius, Mars squaring Pluto, and all of this is intimately linked to the lunation cycle ahead, which means that the new beginning indicated by the solar eclipse is going to pick up these influences and incorporate them into the overall meaning of the eclipse in your birth charts. So that's what we have to break down. Just so you have a sense as well, I might as well just drag this forward a minute and show you. You're going to see the cazimi with Mercury and the Sun essentially right as the Great Conjunction is forming. So you've got Mercury at the heart of the Sun on December 20th, the day before the Great Conjunction on the winter solstice. And then the day after, okay, Mercury picks up dignity, gets out of its detriment, separating from the Sun, starting to recover, gradually beginning its movement into the evening star position. Jupiter and Saturn have conjoined in the sign of Aquarius, right? And on that same day, you're seeing the huge catharsis of Mars square Pluto. So that's why this eclipse deserves 2 videos, right? Because there's a lot to unpack. I love talking about eclipses. Not all eclipses are equal to another. It totally depends on usually the surrounding events and the dispositor chain. Where is Jupiter? What's happening to Jupiter? Whose sign is Jupiter in and where is its host? Are there any big things happening with all of those moving pieces? And that's why we need to, show everybody all of these parts we need to take a look at them to really get the full scope of what's going on. Okay, so this eclipse is also brought to you in part by the south node of the moon. Now, this is a very close eclipse, right? The solar eclipse is very tight because it's within about 4 degrees. The closer it is to the node, generally speaking, you'll hear astrologers say, the more powerful it is. Well, this one's pretty close. Mercury is really close to the south node as that's happening also, within a degree or so. So this is a south node eclipse. What does that mean? Not only that, but you could also, if you wanted to, you could also drag in a little bit of a fading square to Neptune in the midst of this. I'm not going to cover that so much because it is separating, but Mercury is still close to Neptune. So there's maybe a trace of Neptune in the midst of all of this as well, right? It'll be interesting to see how powerful that influence ends up being. My sense is it's going to be diminished. It's going to play a diminished role compared to the things that I've already laid out: the change of Jupiter and Saturn, the square from Mars to Pluto, and the cazimi and changeover and pickup of dignity of Mercury. So what I see here is a kind of the potential for a bit of a crisis, followed by a sigh of relief, or an unexpected and very dramatic turning point that it's very likely that you can't fully judge this eclipse and what it means right away, because whatever initially looks like troubling or difficult or challenging about it will likely change very quickly, and the situation becomes, from my standpoint away, it looks like it gets a lot better pretty quickly. That's the pickup of dignity of Jupiter, the Great Conjunction. Once Mars passes through that square to Pluto, which happens right around the same time as the Great Conjunction, it's like you're passing through a gauntlet of some kind. Overall, I feel like the eclipse signals growth and change and some kind of dynamic new era or beginning in our lives, but it comes through some kind of intense catharsis that initially could make things look worse than they actually will end up being. So that's kind of my feeling about all this. All right, so let me break this down a little bit more. let's talk specifically today about the south node of the moon and its meaning in ancient astrology. In order to do this, we have to talk about both nodes because they come as a pair. So they're called the head and the tail of the dragon. I'm doing a whole workshop series on the nodes of the moon, by the way, as one of the rewards for my Kickstarter. If you want to do a real deep dive, that's not published anywhere else. The head and tail of the dragon, or Rahu and Ketu, have similar but also somewhat different meanings in the ancient Western versus ancient Eastern, sort of Indian astrological traditions. Let's break it down very simply. In modern astrology, a brand new understanding of the nodes of the moon was invented essentially in the last 100 years. And that meaning, which has its roots in people like Dane Rudyard and, what's the guy's name? Martin Schulman and Raymond Merriman and Stephen Forrest and Jeff Green and other people that kind of carry the mantle of this idea that the North Node is what you need to work on, or it's your homework in this lifetime. The South Node is maybe what you learned in previous lifetimes, but tends to represent the hangups from previous lifetimes. As Stephen Forrest often says, the North Node is the meeting, aka the South Node is the bottle. So that's the kind of broad, I'm just simplifying it, but that's the broad view that evolutionary astrologers take. Ancient astrologers had a really different view of the nodes. So this is the one that I use in my practice personally. And I blend them a little bit from the Indian view and the ancient Hellenistic view, which carries over for thousands of years, right? So the south node of the moon, the nodes of the moon, first of all, are related to the ebb and flow of fortune. The rising and falling of fortune in the wheel of fortune that the moon represents. The moon waxes and wanes, grows light, gets big, sheds light, we lose sight of the moon. The moon's path rises up above the ecliptic in latitude, sinks down below, is snaking like a serpent, the head and the tail of the dragon, remember, around the path of the sun, the ecliptic. So when the north node is ascending upward, toward the north, toward the pole star, essentially you get ancient astrologers associating that with increase in fortune, for good or bad. Things that get bigger, things that rise, things that increase. Whereas the south node, when the moon is crossing downward toward the southern horizon, if you're looking towards the south, right, you're looking at the path of the sun in the sky. So there in the southern horizon, of course, it's going to be downward. So that path is associated with diminishment and decline and loss and decay. So not surprisingly, you'll see the malefic planets associated with the south node: loss, decay, destruction, disintegration. The north node, gain, increase, associated with the benefics, differently by different authors. But a simple formula that I think works pretty well is that the north node is a little bit Jupiterian and the south node is a bit Saturnine. And that's one that you see repeated throughout the tradition as well. Now, that's relative, though. Fortune is not, good. I always use this example. It's very simple. You don't want a tumor sitting with the north node of the moon because it will grow. You don't want, but it would be okay for a tumor to be with the south node because it might shrink. So for this reason, ancient astrologers said the north node is good with the good one and bad with the bad one, meaning it will increase the good or the bad, respectively. And the south node, is going to be a good with a bad one and bad with a good one, which means it tends to decrease whatever is with it. It decreases maybe the bad or the malefic qualities, or it may decrease the benefic qualities as well. So it's just decrease for good or bad, increase for good or bad. And depending on the context, what house, what planets are involved with the nodes, you'll see those things play out. For example, Lance Armstrong, the famous cyclist who was involved in a doping scandal. He has Mars on the north node of the moon, so that he's going to gain a lot through martial activities like athletics, strength, muscle, etc. But there's the potential for the north node to amplify things and make them sort of greedy and blown out and excessive. And that's exactly, of course, what happened with him. And he started taking drugs to have a competitive advantage, right? So and south node of the moon, we're going to explore a few examples in a minute, but it tends to diminish things. And that could be good or bad. It just totally depends on the context. And there's nothing to do in the ancient tradition with these nodes having something to do with lessons that you have to learn or steps you have to complete or something like that. That idea is new. So, okay, now in the Indian tradition, there's a story about the way in which the nodes of the moon are come about, Rahu and Ketu. They're these two demons, and they're part of the same body, but the head gets cut off from the rest of the body. The head of the demon is Rahu, and the deceased or decapitated, the decapitated head is Rahu, and the trunk of the body, so to speak, is Ketu. And the reason that the body gets split in half, and there's actually there's some good kids videos on YouTube. If you go to Kids Krishna, I think it's called, or Little Krishna or something like that. There's all these great stories in the Puranas that are presented on this YouTube channel. And one of them actually includes the story of Rahu and Ketu. Anyway, there's this whole big saga within the and this is mentioned in the Mahabharata, and it's mentioned also, of course, in depth in the Bhagavad Purana. But the demons and the demigods are churning up this ocean and ocean of milk, and they're producing the nectar of immortality, and the demons are waiting their turn, and Vishnu's basically going to play a trick to make sure the demons don't get the nectar of immortality, right? But the devas, the demigods, do. So at any rate, Rahu and Ketu, this collective demon, once together, eventually separated, decides that they're going to dress up as a deva and sneak in line and try to get some of the nectar. Of course, Vishnu sees this coming, and he's embodied as one of his feminine forms, Mohini Murti, and he takes I think it's the Sudarshan chakra, the weapon of time. Yeah, it is. And so Rahu drinks the nectar, takes it in, and as the nectar is passing through his throat, Mohini Murti cuts off his head with the disc of time. And so the nectar is caught in Rahu's throat and unable to be assimilated in the body. Of course, one of the interesting things is that if his head is kept alive in this perpetual state because he's got the nectar of immortality in his throat, but the body that's been cut off, that part is in a way liberated. Because when you're killed by Vishnu, one of the perks of being inimical to Vishnu in the scriptures, which is actually really brilliant and beautiful, is that even souls that are inimical to God believe in God. And so there's a way in which if they get into a battle with God, that battle, even if they're killed by God, leads to their enlightenment. And that happens again and again throughout the Shastras. Really interesting. So the deceased body has the touch of the weapon of time that liberates, it vanquishes, but also liberates the enemy. And of course, Rahu is stuck perpetually, a disembodied head with the nectar of immortality in its throat. Now, why is all of this important? Because this is something I go into in the series that I unpack as one of the gifts in the Kickstarter too. So if you're liking this, there's a lot more there. But the idea is that Rahu Ketu, the nodes of the moon, represent the thirst or hunger for immortality, right? So when there's a greedy desire for enlightenment, when there's a greedy desire for growth or power spiritually, let me live forever, let me like that greediness and that hunger for any kind of personal gain that is not righteous or that's not aligned, that hunger is associated with Rahu in the north node of the moon. It's a perpetual hunger, and it drives us as souls into new incarnations after new incarnations, perpetually unsatisfied and craving something material. Not at all the picture of the North Node in modern astrology, right, where it represents a lesson that you need to go learn. No, it's more like a warning about the kind of stuff that you'll think that you need to get to make you happy, but that represents a kind of perpetual greed, lust, hunger, feeling of dissatisfaction, and I need this, I need this, I need this, like that. It can make people very famous if channeled in the right way. I've heard Indian astrologers talk about this a lot, where, if channeled in the right way, it can be a part of, the ambition, if channeled toward doing karma yoga in the world, could be good. Like if you channel that into service in the world, it's not so it's not like just flat out bad, but the baseline of Rahu is that material kind of lust and hunger. Ketu, the south node of the moon, is going to represent the impulse to leave the body, right? Just like it's a deceased and perhaps liberated body of the demon. So to leave the body, to leave the world, to leave the material sphere, but sometimes in problematic or troubling ways, for example, through drugs, sometimes escapist spirituality. Other times it's going to be the true impulse for otherworldliness. And it can be elements of both at different times. So all of that being said, it's a different take on the nodes, but one that I find is extremely helpful when paired alongside of the basic understanding of the nodes in the West, which is this swings of fortune, gaining, increasing, decreasing, diminishing. And depending on context, that means something very specific. What do those two views share in common? Well, very simply, you have the idea that what goes up must come down. You have the idea that in material life, there are seasons of gain and decline, and sometimes the gain isn't always good and the decline isn't always bad. And then you have the idea that there's always something driving us that we're hungry for, that we want more of, but that never actually satisfies us. And there's also this sense of the impulse to leave the world because we're frustrated with it. And that's not always going to work either. I like to say that Rahu and Ketu are like one of those Chinese finger traps from the fair, and you put your fingers in them. If you try to pull out in either direction, it doesn't work. If you try to get stuff in the material world to satisfy your happiness somewhere in the future, doesn't work. If you try to satisfy it by checking out of reality, bypassing, leaving, escaping, doesn't work. So the nodes of the moon in some ways represent that the way that we try to approach happiness through the ups and downs of fortune in the world. And so they're really very similar philosophically, but they get expressed in delineations a little differently. Anyway, so now that you have a sense of the nodes of the moon, let's take a look at what it looks like when the sun is on the south node. And I would use maybe like a 3-4 degree range if it's in your birth chart, especially solar eclipses that are within that range, which this one is. So let's just mention a few people to give you a feeling of what this is like. Remember, the sun as a sense of life purpose or life direction in a general sense, or life action, the ideal toward which our life is moving, like the plot line, is going to be defined by south node type of stuff. Let's say that could mean diminishment, decline, or loss. It could mean otherworldliness or an impulse toward spirit rather than matter, perhaps issues with escapism, loss around solar figures, the sun being a solar figure of some kind, including fathers, but other solar figures as well, the loss or death of solar figures, potential. Okay, so where do we see this? Well, my first example is River Phoenix. Now, River Phoenix was, when he was young, his parents, his parents were hippies, right? And they named him after the river of life. This is from Wikipedia, from the Herman Hesse novel Siddhartha. He received his middle name from the Beatles song Hey Jude. And he described his parents as hippie-ish. Anyway, one of the things that I find interesting is that when he was very young, his parents were sort of traveling hippies who got involved in a cult called the Children of God. And some of you, I actually mentioned this cult in, or actually one of my viewers actually mentioned that they grew up in this Children of God cult. And I'm trying to remember the name of the guy, David Berg or something like that. But at any rate, this was a cult that he got involved in from a very young age. And then, of course, later in life, Though he's, if you've ever read a little bit about River Phoenix, he was like, I'd say he's like one of my favorite kind of nostalgic childhood actors, especially because I loved the movie The Stand, or not The Stand, Stand By Me. Um, River Phoenix, a pretty spiritual guy, and he, of course, had this very otherworldly experience of a cult when he was very young. And one of the things that is interesting about this is that later, of course, not even as an adult, really still a kid, he develops a drug addiction, and that's how he dies. So it's a very sun-south node kind of story, right? Simple example, but really gets to the heart of it. Now, the other person on my list that has a sun-south node conjunction that gives a really vivid example is Tyler Perry. So some of you guys probably know Tyler Perry from what was it, Medea's Family Reunion, or Diary of a Mad Black Woman, or I forget. There's a bunch of them now too. But at any rate, let me just read this to you. Perry once said his father's answer to everything was to beat it out of you. As a child, Perry once went so far as to attempt suicide in an effort to escape his father's beatings. See how that sun-south node, the escape, the suicide, the father who is basically dissociating you from your body, but with all the trauma. But interestingly, as he grows older, he has a really redemptive, transformative kind of bounce back, and in part his career is defined by, I mean, his first, what was it? I forget. One of his first stage productions that sort of started launching his career was rooted in Christian themes, and a lot of his followers follow him because they feel that there's a Christian environment in the movies that are his movies and so forth that are hospitable to Christianity. So I find that he's another really vivid example of Sun in the South Node, where you've got the emphasis on spiritual transformation, a really troubled father figure, a suicide attempt. All of that is right there in the mix. Okay, I'm just doing these briefly. I know I can't do justice to the full, complexity of these figures, but another South Node Sun conjunction person is Helen Keller. Now, one of the reasons that I think Helen Keller is interesting is that Helen Keller's father passed away when she was 16 years old. Now, of course, you probably know Helen Keller as a famous kind of educator / activist for the blind and the deaf. I think it's both. So at any rate, but he died when she was very young, and he was instrumental in getting her the teacher that would end up, what's her name, was Miss Sullivan. He was the one who was instrumental in getting her the teacher that would come to teach and help her after she had become blind as a young girl. And then he passed away very early on as she was basically a teenager. Why is this also interesting? Because weirdly, sometimes that Sun-South node conjunction will also can speak to people losing eyesight, as the sun and the moon, both when they're eclipsed, can point to blindness or eye problems. I think that's a fascinating one, because what you're doing is you're diminishing the organ of perception, as Vettius Valens called it, right? The sun. So if she loses that eyesight, her father becomes this really instrumental figure in helping her to get this teacher that's so important in her life, and then he dies really young. So those are really like tragic examples. I feel like I want to issue a qualifier and say that it's not always going to be that intense, right? But those are some of the big, vivid themes that you can see. I have the South Node of the Moon on my midheaven, for example. And, I grew up a preacher's kid in the church, had a drug addiction for a while, turned it around with a psychedelic, plant medicine from the Amazon, into yoga and astrology. And probably the biggest like escape mode in my life was when I had an opiate addiction in my early 20s, which is weird to think about now because it was kind of at the outset of the opiate epidemic. And I was right in that kind of Midwest range. I picked up the addiction while working at a restaurant where I don't know if you guys have ever worked in restaurants, but that was like, for me, that was like a total breeding ground for drugs, because of the life of being in a restaurant 24/7 and like partying with the staff. And like and there were really good people that I still really love in my life that came from that era of my life. But there were some people who obviously I got involved with, and the opiate thing, Oxycontin in particular, and it actually started because I was prescribed it first for an injury that I suffered. Anyway, but that was the very south node, right? And then it's interesting how that morphed at the midheaven, the south node of my chart morphed into trying to treat addiction with a psychedelic plant beverage, right? Right. So there's that otherworldliness, and it can be a fine line between whether the south node is pointing you towards the spiritual dimensions of life, or if it's something that's purely about escape. And if you're a south node kind of person, if you've got it on your ascendant or your midheaven, or if you've got planets conjoined with it, you always have to watch for that. It's like something to be aware of. And the north node too. The north node, while it can be about this kind of endless aggression, hunger, thirst to be successful, powerful, have things, it's very lusty. When people filter that to wanting to do good things for others in whatever area of the chart the north node points to, like I have seen it, it's not always just the basis description that you'll find in the the Vedic literature or whatever. So at any rate, all of that aside, let's come back to the eclipse now. What are we getting from this eclipse? We're getting the idea here is that there is this kind of otherworldly energy around this. It could point toward the death or loss of solar figures. It could point toward diminished health or vitality, or diminished ability to see or understand something, which kind of ties into that Mercury under the beams and combust with the square to Neptune, things that are secretive, things that are hidden, things that come out by surprise. For example, drug addicts, I'm just speaking from my own experience, often hide things, right? So you'll hide your habit. You don't want people to see it. This eclipse could point toward things that are hidden, that are more covert, that are perhaps more escapist in nature, hidden attacks on solar figures. Unfortunately, like we saw recently when we had the Antisha, we saw the Iranian nuclear scientist that was assassinated. This is a south node, eclipse, given the Mars-Pluto dynamic coming up, that could result in some kind of volatile or hostile but covert attack. Something like that. So there's elements of this that make me say, just be careful on things that are sneaking up on you, including your own unconscious. Could there be a sneak attack from your own, lower qualities? Or could there be something that comes up and clouds your judgment, or that an impulse to escape from someone or something in an unhealthy manner? Those would all be things that I think we could be on the watch for. Just, not like, I don't want everyone sitting around just anticipating the worst, but those are some warnings around this one. There is also a Jupiterian dynamic taking place. There's a new order that's being built, but the power of the old order is sort of rearing its head. And the way that you can see that, and whatever that means to you personally, I'm not talking now about the world stage, I'm talking about it as an archetypal dynamic. The Jupiter in its fall underneath this eclipse says an old order, something malignant, something stagnant is being empowered, but very quickly it changes. Very quickly. It's like it's a flashpoint of some kind. And then you got Jupiter turning around and hitting the conjunction to Saturn. So I look at this and I go, could something pop up that's a little devastating, unexpected, a little covert, a ding to the ego, the unexpected surge of something from the unconscious, an old bill that's due karmically that comes up, but very quickly is able to be overcome. The reason I get that is because everything I've already said about the South Node paired with the Pluto-Mars dynamic, that square is also very cathartic. And then, but right after the cathartic, I mean, it's coinciding right with, things coming out, things improving for Mercury, things coming out of hiding, in other words, and for Mercury being under the beams of the sun, combust square Neptune. It's coming out as the great conjunction is happening, something airy, something light, something uplifting, a new order, a new plan, a new architecture for life that's being established. But it could be a little painful because, again, because you're seeing this potential for ego death, loss of certainty, a plan or an old way of doing things that has to change suddenly, right? It's something like that. Another thing that I would point to is that not everything that we lose or that's diminished is a bad thing. There's release in what we lose, and that's a South Node lesson as well. That idea of releasing things, being released from different kinds of bondage. That could be, the worst would be bodily bondage in the form of death, right? But the picture here is also something or someone getting freed up from something, coming out from underneath a shadow in our life that's been maybe empowered for too long. So that's kind of the general message that I'm getting behind this eclipse. It's going to be very different in each individual's chart. I could also see this as something that we're seeing recover, that we see some act of recovery, where you start off with something, it's a little broken, it looks like something's being diminished, the light is being dimmed, but then there's this turn really quickly, and things suddenly, there's a way of addressing the problem that comes about pretty quickly. So I think all of this is hopeful, but the next, unfortunately, like between Monday on the eclipse day and say the new year, still a little bit of dicey astrology to get through as we're making this turn. But overall, I feel that it's very positive. So on Monday, we'll come back and take a look at the eclipse through the houses. If you guys have any questions about the eclipse, feel free to drop it into the comments section or email me info@nightlightastrology.com and put in the subject line YouTube question. I'll be happy to try to incorporate anything that you feel like I'm missing. I would love to hear your stories. Are you a Sun South Node kind of person? Do you have any planets near the South Node that you can interpret in light of what we're saying here today? I'd love to hear those stories. It's always interesting to hear what you guys are doing. Don't forget that we're just like 89 backers shy of beating last year's record. We're about halfway done with the fundraiser. So we're just making an incredible, we're setting an incredible pace right now. You can pick up readings, you can pick up, discounted tuition to all of my programs. Really appreciate your support. Hopefully we will, have a much improved 2021. 2020 was rough. So I'm looking forward to making content in a year where maybe things get back to normal a little bit, whatever the new normal is. All right, that's what I've got, you guys. Have a great weekend. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.